So you all know E.J. Dionne. You read his column in the Post. He actually passed out a column that he wrote yesterday on our topic. It's about church and state. Take a look at that. A lot of things you can say about E.J. What's your new book?
Oh, the new book is called, it comes out in May or June of next year. It's called Our Divided Political Heart. And we were still, I'm having a conversation this afternoon about the subtitle, but the subtitle I think we will agree on is The Battle for the American Idea in an Age of Discontent. And what I argue is that there's a deep tension in American political history and within all of us between our love of individualism and our affection for community. And we tend to tell our national story almost entirely on the individualistic side. But I argue that if you look at the long run of our history, it's a mistake to view us as pure radical individualists. And then I have some ancillary arguments beneath that about the role of government in our history, where I argue that from the beginning, government played an important role in our nation's development, and that the exceptional period was the Gilded Age period, and that a lot of people are looking back to the Gilded Age, roughly 35 years, as the norm for 235 years. So in any event, it's been fun to write. My favorite, I'm going to ask the one question I'm going to ask whenever I do promotion on the book. When do you think the first federal health care program was passed? Does anyone know? I found 3 people who knew the answer to this, which I didn't know before I did this.
Right after the Civil War.
Nope. Good guess, though, because there were other social programs passed. No, the first federal health care program was passed in 1798. And there was John Adams signed a law creating a system of hospitals for sick and injured seamen. And so we had socialized medicine for seamen from almost the beginning of the Republic. Who would have imagined that? Anyway, so that's what the book is about.
Well, the book will be a great follow-up to this class, so it'll come out next semester. Like I say about E.J., he's a great friend, and I would say he knows he's my favorite columnist in America, but also he writes about our topic more intelligently than I think anybody else does, the role of faith in public life, the importance of diversity, pluralism, but how faith should and could shape our moral compass without being a divisive factor. We're honored to have you today. And the topic is, of course, media and religion, but your reflections were about that and the whole range of what kind of factors should religion be in elections and with politics, and how. Is it about the particulars of religion? Is it about policy, moral compass, all of that? So there's no one better to address that than E.J. So we're blessed, I can say blessed in Georgetown, blessed to have you today. And he's going to lecture to us for a while, and then we'll have a chance to ask him all the questions you ever wanted to ask E.J. Dionne. So let's give him a warm welcome, and thank you, E.J., for coming.
Thank you. I've been a Jim Wallis fan for a very, very long time, really going back to the 1970s. And I think one of the things that's important to know about Jim is that he has been making an argument about religion's important role in public life, and particularly an argument to progressives for a very long time. And it took an awfully long time for progressives to catch up with him. I always like to say that Democrats discovered God in the 2004 exit polls. Now, since you can discover God anywhere, there's nothing wrong with that. And in truth and in fairness, if you go back to earlier times, there are plenty of liberal and democratic leaders who understood the importance of religion. Nobody quoted the Bible more correctly, actually, than Bill Clinton. I always like to tell the story of, I wrote a column once where I quoted, this was when a lot of people were down on President Bush for talking about religion too much, and I quoted this president who quoted St. Paul, "We are all part of one another," and he went on and gave this great sermon on that. And I said, "You dislike it if your president talks that way?" And of course my liberal readers said, "Yeah, Bush shouldn't talk that way." And I said, well, that was Bill Clinton at the Metropolitan Baptist Church. But there was really a resistance, and I think there is an interesting tension within liberalism and progressivism about religion. Jim was there making this case, and suddenly Democrats woke up the day after the 2004 election and said, who is thinking about this? And finally, lots of people who had never read him before started paying attention to Jim. And so I'm very grateful for his ministry and his engagement in public life. I made the mistake, actually, of giving you that Commonweal sort of talk I gave many years ago, because that talk includes many of my very favorite stories about the question of how the media cover religion. And I'll probably just tell a couple of them again on the theory that not all students always do all of the readings, although in Jim Wallis's class they probably all do. But there were a couple of stories I told in there that I think are kind of sort of relevant to how the problems with the way the media treats religion. My favorite is the one about a friend who covered the Vatican. His name actually is Victor Simpson, and he was the AP bureau chief. And no one knew more about the Vatican or cared more about sort of religion and the media, or was better at it. But he also had a very acute sense of his audience. And I believe I quoted him in that piece one day that we were on a trip with Pope John Paul II, and we were landing in several different countries that day. So they gave us a big stack of papal speeches, and you know, Victor has to write right away, a file as soon as he gets off the plane. And so he sort of reads through all this stuff and says, what am I going to write about? There's nothing but religion here. And of course, this is the Pope. You would expect him to talk about religion, but it wouldn't make much news if you talked about what the Pope said about the Virgin Mary. It wouldn't make much news if to quote him on anything that was directly religious. Of course, what everybody liked to quote the Pope on were politics or sex, which is the second story I believe I told in that, about a friend from the United Press International back in the days when it was a serious news agency. And she said that if you wanted your story on The Wire to be used in every paper in the country, just put the words Pope and sex in the lead, and everybody everywhere is going to use it. And I was once criticizing that tendency in my column, and I quoted that in the lead, which of course was my way of putting the words Pope and sex in my lead, even as I was criticizing this particular approach to covering the Pope. The question of the press's coverage of religion and politics can't be separated from the general question of how the press covers religion. And I think there is a fundamental tension between what the media's deep assumptions are, and I don't say this as an outside critic, I say this as an inside participant, and religious questions. Because in some ways, journalism is the quintessential Enlightenment religion, the quintessential Enlightenment profession, rather. Because it's very empirical, it's all about prove it to me, give me data, show me. It's a skeptical profession, and it should be, and I think that's part of the essence of it. But when you are talking about matters of faith, you can, of course, quote St. Thomas Aquinas, but proof becomes very hard on these matters. Even the words we use are vexed. I was once writing what, in principle, should be one of the simplest kind of stories you have to write. It was, this was back when I was covering the Vatican again for the New York Times, and I was covering papal mass on the midnight mass for Easter. And so, of course, Pope often says something very important in that mass. And I started typing a sentence, and it was Easter, the day that Christians blank as the day Jesus rose from the dead, or which memorializes the day Jesus rose from the dead, something like that. And I kept going through words in my head, and I thought, well, claimed Jesus rose from the dead. Well, that makes the resurrection sound like a crime. Allege, it makes it sound untrue. Allege Jesus rose from the dead, that makes it sound like a crime. And finally, I may have loaded it a little bit one way, and I said revere as the day that Jesus rose from the dead. But just the very choice of that single word, I think, can sort of show how vexed this is. How do you write about angels and devils? I had fun again in my Vatican days where I actually did manage to write a story about both the devil and angels. Angels, the Pope gave this very interesting, John Paul gave this very interesting series of sermons on angels. But on the devil, I had a very interesting opportunity because the Archdiocese of Turin, it became big news all over Italy that they had named a panel of exorcists. And so the Italian press was full of stories under headlines like, "Does the devil live in Turin?" And so I decided I had to go up to Turin to see if I could find the devil. And there are a couple of interesting things that happened on that trip. The first was I visited the Archdiocesan office. And for those of you who know Italy at all, the northern Italians, and particularly the people up in the Turin area, see themselves as deep rationalists against the irrationality of southern Italy. I don't hold this view. I'm just reporting what their view of the question is. And so they were very vexed that there were all these stories about satanic cults in Turin, of all places, the most rational city in Italy. And I sat down with a priest who was the spokesman for the diocese, and he explained that the reason they had named this group of exorcists is because the Vatican had put out a request to all dioceses around Italy to name exorcists, and Turin just happened to be the most efficient city in Italy, so they named the exorcists before anyone else got around to doing so. But then I had heard about a priest out in this beautiful village in the mountains who had performed exorcisms, and I went one afternoon and I heard he was saying Mass at 5 o'clock, so I went to his Mass and then interviewed him afterward. And he was a very interesting man because he had been a worker priest, which some of you may remember. He was very committed to social justice. He was basically quite a progressive Catholic priest, but he believed devoutly in the devil and was absolutely convinced that he had cast out devils. And as he was talking, I must say it was very hard for me to disbelieve him. He was very persuasive, both in the way he talked about evil in the world, which is something I think we moderns have a hard time accepting, and in having this experience. And in the end, I wrote this New York Times article on this whole experience, and I couldn't resist closing with a quotation, and I thought it would sort of play with the minds of my New York Times readers, from C.S. Lewis. If you remember the Screwtape Letters, where Satan says to his nephew, all we have to do is get them to believe we don't exist, and then we've won. Now you could argue I loaded the piece, but I just sort of was laying that out as a possibility. But you don't get that many opportunities to write pieces of that sort when you are doing regular journalism. So I think the first challenge is, how does a fundamentally rationalistic line of work deal with matters of faith? And maybe we can talk some more about that. Secondly, I think there's great disagreement within the journalistic profession of how much coverage there should be about religion. And I've had these discussions in journalism for more, alas, this just shows I've been around a long time, but for over 30 years. And there are, there are some folks in journalism who believe this is a private matter, this is not really a matter of public concern, we shouldn't really cover this all that much. That's still a minority view, but it is a view. But then there's the second part, which is we only get in trouble when we cover this stuff. Because, as I alluded to in that Commonweal piece, I think there's a fundamental contradiction in what religious people assert that they want and what they actually want from the media. That what you will hear on the one side is a lot of religious folks saying you don't take religion seriously, you don't cover religion seriously enough, it's an important social and economic institution, it's an important intellectual institution, and so they say all that. I happen to agree with most of that. On the other side, if you take religion seriously like you take everything else and begin to report on it critically, then many of the same folks who are complaining about not getting coverage will turn around and attack you for being anti-religious or being against their particular denomination or tradition. And that's one of the reasons I wanted you to read that column I wrote, because I think there is an element of you can't have it both ways in this field. I think the proper synthesis of this is that the media should treat religion very seriously, and that people involved in religious institutions have to accept that this will sometimes lead to critical coverage, obviously particularly when there are issues of various kinds of corruption. And religious institutions are the creations of human beings, even if they are designed to express devotion to the world beyond and something higher than ourselves. And so you have to accept that, that compromise. The third is a lot of people don't find religion all that interesting. Now that one I find peculiar, because one of the reasons I've always liked to write about religion is that you can learn an awful lot about other human beings by talking to them about their faith or their lack of faith. How people approach ultimate questions can allow you to enter into conversation with people at a wholly different level than you normally engage with them. I think one of the greatest things about being a journalist is that you have an excuse to ask absolutely anyone any question at any time, which doesn't normally exist. I mean, and I have that nature anyway, as you saw right when I started. But it's really fascinating to engage people, and I find that when you engage them on religious questions, you can really reach to a lot of different areas, both about their sort of social and political commitments, but also about their personal commitments and about who they are and how they think and why they think how they think. And so I think this is a great area of interest. There was, I think, a kind of correction within the media over a period of years. I think that there were some very good editors at major institutions and producers at major radio and television networks who realized that the coverage of this area just had not been serious enough. It tended to be sporadic. New York Times did it quite seriously for a long time. Washington Post had some very serious people. But in the 90s, and I think some of this was a reaction to the rise of the religious right, people realized, hey, something really important is going on here, and we better understand it better, and our readers had better understand it better. And so you had a lot of very smart people hired. You had a lot of people, more time given to it, more space given to it. And then the crisis of journalism happened, and the collapse of the old economic model happened. And I think that having made this progress, you're seeing some retrogression in the amount of space and time allocated. And again, it's a risk-reward thing if you're an editor, because do you gain more in surus and trouble and attacks than you would gain in terms of giving your readers something that they need to know and ought to know. But at least I think we made that progress. The regress I see in a different way. If you go back to the 1940s and 1950s, you had people like Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich on the cover of Time magazine. You had actually quite serious coverage of religion and religious institutions as contributing a great deal to American intellectual life. And whether people agreed or disagreed, this was part of the public conversation. Can you imagine Reinhold Niebuhr or Paul Tillich getting booked on a chat show today? It's just very hard. Maybe you can, David.
Niebuhr was pretty sad.
What? Niebuhr was pretty, yeah, maybe he'd pull it off. But I think there's something peculiar about our era that it would make it very difficult for people like that. And it also makes it difficult for people who actually do exist who are like that to get serious attention in the media. And that's where I think the rise of the religious right has had some negative impacts, partly because of how liberals dealt with the religious right. And I've always thought that on the one hand there was a long period where, because they were where the action was in politics, beginning in the late 70s when they started to become more influential, obviously particularly in the Republican Party, the assumption was that religion always lives on the right, has a particular set of beliefs, and there was no room for, say, the Jim Wallises of the world, or just tens of thousands, and in the United States, millions of people who were very serious about their religious commitments, but didn't fall into this stereotype of being some kind of conservative or ultra-conservative or whatever they were called. And I've always wondered sometimes if there was an unconscious and unspoken conspiracy between a certain style of liberalism and a certain style of religious conservative, because a certain style of liberal sees that kind of politics and those assumptions as the natural outgrowth of religion, that for a certain style of liberal, and I'm a liberal, and I don't want to sort of tar the entire liberal community, but I think there is a view that religion really doesn't make sense to some liberals unless it is seen as something right-wing. And so you had this, I think, peculiar coincidence of interest that neither side would ever acknowledge, and wouldn't want to acknowledge, and I'm not even sure either side was fully aware of it. But I think it led to a certain kind of coverage of religion that privileged the most conservative and fundamentalist forms of religion, and actually hurt, diminished coverage of more moderate or progressive forms of religion. That's something else I would I would love to chat about. A couple other things I want to put on the table. It is sometimes easier to write seriously about religion when you are covering a large institution that people take seriously. And that's one of the reasons why, if you like to write about religion as I do, covering the Vatican was, if I may quote Robert Bork from another context, an intellectual feast. Because when you looked at the Vatican, and you looked at particularly Pope John Paul's papacy, there were so many different strands that came together. I used to joke that when I was covering the Vatican, a lot of my time was spent covering the North American heresy, which was about sex, and Charlie Curran and Father Charlie Curran and birth control and all that, and the South American heresy, which was about Marxism and the liberation theologians, Gustavo Gutierrez, Leonardo Boff, and others. And so you had that whole area. By the way, when I covered the Vatican, you could tell if you read one of my stories that I had an American source inside Cardinal Ratzinger's office, because when they condemned Friar Boff, I quoted a High Vatican official who said, "Boff makes Rome sound like a four-letter word," which actually only makes sense in English. So, but he was a very interesting priest, actually. He was no longer with us. You know, so there was this whole area. Then there was the whole area of diplomacy, and the Vatican played a very important role, and I learned a lot when I was there about, you know, the Vatican didn't need a CIA, because think of what it means to have a network of tens and tens and tens of thousands of parishes all over the world. The Vatican was an enormous source of information, particularly in areas for Americans where the Americans couldn't penetrate to the degree that the Catholic Church could penetrate all the way down to the most local level. And so there were a lot of conversations of this sort that went on between the Vatican and our government and other governments. Obviously, it was the days of the Cold War, and the Pope's role was very important. At the time I was there was a great debate inside the Vatican about whether the Catholic Church should come out against the missile defense system, Star Wars. They were less aggressive against that than they were against other kinds. They were generally on, if you will, the pro-peace side. But there was some reluctance, I think partly because of John Paul's views about the Soviet Union and Soviet oppression and his experience in Poland. And then there was the art and the pageantry, and that is extraordinary, extraordinary to write about. I even got to write a piece about the keeper of the Latin language. There is somebody in the Vatican whose job it is to keep Latin up to date. And I was not a good Latin student in my Catholic school. I only did 2 years, and then I moved on. But I enjoyed it. I had a couple of good Latin teachers, and it was fun to figure out how this person was keeping a dead language alive, in a sense, since it is not a dead language inside the Roman Catholic Church or inside the 108 acres of Vatican City. So I think it's much easier to cover religion institutionally. And again, that has some advantages and some disadvantages. I mean, the advantages are obvious. It gives you a locus. everybody, even no matter how secular or uninterested in religion people are, they understand that this or that religious institution is important. But for a great many believers, the centralized institution is not the center of why they are in a church, why they are part of a tradition. It is usually, or it is often, a combination of the deeply personal and the smaller community, whether it be usually the parish or a local church or a local synagogue. And so there are distortions that can enter in that way. And I'll close by just talking about the question I raised in this column, which is, in a presidential campaign, which we're about to face, what kinds of questions are legitimate to ask a candidate about his or her religious faith? And if you had a chance to look at this, I just gave it to you at the last minute. It seems to me that there are certain religious questions that are not relevant to the public discussion and certain religious questions that are. I don't think the particulars of a candidate's view of the afterlife will shape what that person might do in office, or how someone keeps kosher laws, or whether they believe in the virgin birth or not, or whether they believe in transubstantiation, a doctrine which I think most of us don't fully understand even when we claim to believe in it, but that's another, that's for the theology students can explain it to us. These are not public questions, and I think that asking them is not particularly appropriate unless a candidate themselves chooses to, whatever a candidate chooses to make central, it becomes a legitimate question. But there are a whole series of questions that I think are legitimate, and especially if a candidate is saying that their religious faith is very important to how they believe or how they would govern. And again, this is another you can't have it both ways issue, because I do believe that religion has a wholly legitimate place in public life. And if you look at our history, it has played a central role in so many different moments in our history. Notably in the abolitionist movement, in the civil rights movement, a lot of the people who became progressives after the turn of the century started out as in settlement houses. They were Christians going to do one-on-one social work, and they realized that they couldn't get as much done on behalf of the people they cared about one-on-one, and they needed to change government policy. They needed to change the social structure of the country, and so they became active politically. And of course, the civil rights movement would not have been what it was without the African American church. And it was to show my influence of all that time I spent in the Vatican. I actually came to view the black church in America as very similar to the Catholic Church in Poland under communism, that in the African American community, the church was often the one truly free space that was under the control of African Americans themselves in a sea of oppression where they didn't have a lot of room to move. They had room to move inside the churches. And so similarly in Poland, the Catholic Church, even for non-believers, became a sort of free space in which people could operate. So religion has played an important role, and it continues to do so now. Now, this is a very tricky question because, as you see in that column, I think it would be very wrong to say that Mitt Romney or John Huntsman, we can't vote for them because they're Mormons. I think those of us who are liberals or Catholics, for example, or Jews, should especially be opposed to that, although, as I argue, in our nation there is no religious majority. We are all minorities, and so we better be sympathetic to the rights of religious minorities. And if Mormonism can be held against Romney, then our faith, or our lack of faith, can be held against us. And so I think it's an interesting line to walk. I don't think his Mormonism as such is a central public issue, or should be, yet how a candidate's religious views translate into their attitudes on abortion or the death penalty or social justice or war and peace, these are vital public questions. And it would be lovely if we could have a public conversation about these things without having someone immediately call foul And I think they're conversations we can have that cross religious lines. I'll close with a story I believe I may have told in that Commonweal piece. It's one of my favorite, I always like telling this story to journalism students, and it was when I was traveling with the Pope down to Africa. I decided the old, now it's called the Sunday Review, but the old New York Times Weekend Review section, I called Netter, I said, we've taken every idea seriously, communism, capitalism, socialism, various kinds of Protestantism, Catholicism, Judaism. I want to take animism seriously. I want to take traditional African religion seriously. Well, it was a papal trip, so the piece ended up being about the interaction between traditional African belief and Catholicism, and there really is a lot of interaction, and the story I began the piece with was an indication of that. The Pope was traveling to a place called Bamenda, which is in Cameroon, and the press plane landed an hour or so ahead of the Pope. And so we got out. It was pouring rain, and someone told me it had been raining for 6 days. And you know, I have out my little notebook, and then I'm talking to a young man who, as I remember, was working for the information ministry of that province or something, college-educated Catholic. And he said to me, don't worry, it's not going to rain on the Pope. And so I write this in my little notebook, and I said, why isn't it going to rain on the Pope? He said, well, I know because the rain doctors told me. And of course, this was somebody who was a Catholic, but also still held a real loyalty to some of the traditional beliefs. This is an absolutely true story. So I write all this down and start talking to other people. Then the Pope's plane lands. As the Pope's plane lands, it stops raining. Pope gets out, says, you know, walks to the altar, great cheers, says the Mass. At one moment during the Mass, the sun briefly comes out, sort of shining on the Pope's face. And the Mass is over, he blesses the crowd, gets back on the plane, and it starts pouring again. And this young man came running toward me, getting drenched with a huge smile on his face, saying, I told you, I told you. Now, I always like to tell this story because what do you assume happened here? Now, I always, you know, that the normal secular assumption would be that this is a total accident. It just, the guy said it and this happened. Well, how do you know that? Even under the most strenuously secular rules of knowledge, how do you know that the rain doctors don't know something that the maybe the secular meteorologists didn't know? And so the lead I put on the story was it's not clear who had done the work, but someone with a capital S was clearly on the job. And with that, I will join you at the table and we can chat about theories of knowledge or politics and religion. But thank you very much.
Okay, well, you can see why I'm such a big fan of EJ's and how he sorts these questions out. I want to ask you a question, and I want you all to be thinking about the question you want to ask. This is
or challenge.
Or challenge.
Yes.
We allow challenge here.
I like disagreement. I get a lot of critical email, and my favorite began that I can repeat to you in this august university. Dear Mr. Dionne, are you as dumb in person? And at the end of this class, you may get nothing else out of it, but you'll be able to answer that question for yourself. But I like argument, and when I get negative feedback from readers, I always end the emails, disagreement is one of the joys of freedom, which I actually believe.
Now, let's take your column from yesterday. A number of your papers reflected this view that religion should be pertinent, as he just says, to what extent would a candidate's religious views affect what he or she might do in office? So let me ask you, let's say we could get CNN or someone during the campaign to do a forum. You know, they're doing forums on various topics. Let's say the forum is on religion, faith, values, politics. It's this topic. And let's say they're smart enough to ask you to moderate this, which would be a very good move on their part. So let's say you have all the candidates up there, the Republicans, and Obama's there too. So you're asking questions of Michelle Bachmann and Kaine and Perry and Santorum and Obama, and you want to ask the religious questions that are important and not the ones that aren't. So you're not going to ask Romney and Huntsman about the doctrine of Mormonism. So just off the top of your head, you're there talking to them. What do you want to ask some of them? Obama, Bachman, Perry. What is important to ask as opposed to what's not? How their religion might affect their political leadership.
You know, it's interesting Jim asked that question because he was involved directly, I think, when CNN had some forums like that during the last campaign. And they might be worth actually looking at online. I'm sure you can find them on YouTube or something. Because they were, I ended up having very complicated feelings about those particular sessions. There were parts of them that I thought were absolutely wonderful, where the questions were good questions. And then when I say complicated, some of the questions that I didn't think were legitimate to ask of public officials nonetheless produced some very interesting answers. But because you did have more questioning than under my rules would seem appropriate about the nature of their personal faith. And the candidates were willing to talk about those things. Although I find what's always disturbing in this area, perhaps even more than in other areas, one assumes that a candidate is saying the things he or she thinks will help him or her get elected. So it shouldn't surprise us that they would do that with religion as they would with anything else. And yet it is perhaps because I accord religion as somewhat higher plane, or at least a non-worldly plane, that I think it's especially bothersome when they sort of manipulate religious symbols for public purposes. And so it's really hard, I think, at that very personal level to figure out when is someone giving you valuable information about who they are and what makes them tick. And when are they sort of telling stories that they think will appeal to voters that may or may not be all that important to them. One of the reasons I like, and I'm sure Jim has had you read it, Barack Obama's speech at his Call to Renewal conference in 2006, is because, as far as I know, he is the only public official who ever talked about religion by admitting that he had doubts. And he had a whole little section on that piece when he talked about doubt. And I have to say, I liked the way he put it together overall. And I think one thing I would criticize actually about these first 3 years is I don't think he has talked enough about the relationship of religion to public life. But this was a really remarkable speech. But it was really remarkable to see somebody candid enough to say that doubt is an essential part of faith in certain ways, that you can't take these questions seriously without ever having some doubt about something enter your mind. But that's a very unusual thing. So to answer, so I think it's a very tricky area, and even questions I'd rule out of bounds, I would nonetheless concede can produce interesting public information. They can also produce, as you will recall, some very awkward moments where you saw candidates answering questions they probably shouldn't have been asked and probably didn't want to answer. But there were two things I think I would do. The first is I would do a lot of research on what candidates had actually said themselves about their faith and what they had said about the connection of their faith to particular views on particular issues, because I think that that voters, candidates do have that right to have their political convictions arise in whole or in part from their religious views. And if they talk about them publicly, we voters of all religious stripes and none have a right to know how that actually works. So that's the first thing I do. And I would focus, I think, a lot of attention on where they themselves had talked about faith and how it relates to public life. Secondly, I think that the area of religious pluralism, religious liberty, exactly how you draw the lines between government, the government sphere, and say the social services. I think those questions are constantly live questions. We have a long history of partnerships between government and faith-based groups. Yet we have a lot of disagreement about where the line should be drawn, and notably on issues like what freedom should religious institutions have on hiring people of their own faith, or if you cast it from the other side, should they be able to discriminate against people who are not part of their own faith? I mean, if you want one of the thorniest questions in politics, which Jim has had a lot of experience with, that's one of them. So I think that's a whole legitimate area. And then I would be tempted to ask questions about, you know, here I would probably cross the line from neutral moderator to somebody with a particular point of view. There's a famous guy who happens to be sitting next to me who once said that if you cut all of Jesus's references to the poor out of the New Testament, you'd have a scripture full of holes. I'm paraphrasing. And I'd love to know how people who say they are Christian think of how Jesus's words apply to public policy. Now, there are a lot of legitimately different answers to that. There are a lot of Christians who are skeptical of certain kinds of government programs, who believe they should be done, a lot more should be done through private institutions. But that opens up a whole other area question that I think is legitimately asked. So that's a kind of thing I would try to do.
Now, on the CNN thing that you mentioned, what was interesting, we picked different faith leaders to ask questions. The faith leaders, by and large, stuck to the principle of asking them how their faith would impact this kind of policy question. The media people, the CNN people, were the ones who asked the out-of-bounds questions. The moderator, I had her agree with me beforehand, she wouldn't bring up Hillary Clinton's marriage. And she just went right to that. Infidelity, how'd you feel when you talk about prayer, what happens to you when you're praying, you know, what do you feel when you're praying? So it was the media.
And then Hillary, by the way, hit a real home run on this. It was one of those things where I agreed with Jim, I wouldn't have gone there, yet by going there, she got an extraordinarily revealing answer, and it sounded authentic to me.
And her handlers were furious. They blamed me because she had been asked these questions, and yet she was so brilliant, they didn't even realize how good she was and how much she won people's hearts and minds by the way she talked about her experience with infidelity in her marriage and prayer.
And so, just ironically, Obama, who had spoken so effectively about these things, almost precisely because he stuck to principles, was less effective than Hillary was that day because his answers were so issue-focused that they seemed to evade the religious link. You had that impression that day.
Yeah, he was like detached. He just wasn't present. All right, so given your principles, you just lined out, okay? Let me just name a few of the candidates. So if they were here, what you would ask them. So you say in your column, Romney's Mormonism or his doctrines aren't what you would focus on. What would you ask Romney?
Well, I think I go back to the speech he gave. Romney tried to grapple with the problem, in quotes, he had with white evangelical voters in the Iowa caucuses by giving a speech in 2007. I guess it was the end, if I remember, at the end of 2007. And I thought that there was a contradiction that ran right through that speech. It was really two speeches at the same time, where in the first half it was kind of a little bit like a John F. Kennedy Houston minister's speech, which is you shouldn't hold someone's religion against them in public life, and that was quite coherent. And then the second half was trying to assert how Christian he was and how to create a link between himself and the religious right. And the way he phrased things, I wish I had it in front of me, sounded like he would extend a lot more religious freedom to believers than non-believers. And so I would want to ask him about that speech, which is a very interesting speech, but at least I thought, and I'm not alone in this, thought had a deep contradiction that ran through it. I thought he could give the first half or the second half, but to put both together created an intellectual problem for him.
Let's take Michelle Bachmann and Governor Perry, who both have been accused as being dominionists and so on. What would you they've both been very outspoken. I'm focused on ones who talked about the religion the most, like Perry. And what would you want to ask them about what the religion means?
Well, I think with Michelle Bachmann, I take Ryan Liz's piece in the New Yorker, which, if you haven't read it, is very much worth reading. Ryan happens to be a friend whom I admire enormously as a journalist and also as a person. You know, I think he raised. Bachmann had suggested that she had something in common with these dominionists. What I would do is give her an opportunity to say, here is some of what they have said. Here's what you have said about them. Do you believe this? If you don't believe this, what do you believe about this? Again, you know, it is, you know, the public declarations of candidates on religious matters carry, you know, I think, create opportunities for dialogue and legitimate lines of questioning. You know, with Perry, I do some of the same with, I thought he should have been pressed, for example, much harder about the sympathetic minister who said what he said about Romney and, you know, Mormonism being a cult. I know a couple who was one is a Mormon and one is a Catholic, and she said, "Oh yes, we're a pair of cultists." You know, but to press him harder about how much does he separate himself from that and from some of the other speakers that he sponsored, you know, at that rally. I might ask him, why is it appropriate for a governor to run a religious rally of that sort? Now, he has some legitimate answers to that, but I'd like to see him talk about that. And again, I think that's of interest to people who may not share his tradition. You know, because actually George W. Bush, for all the criticisms, many including myself, made of him on a lot of fronts, was actually quite careful in his public use of religious language. I think was much more careful than Rick Perry seems to have been. Right. And I'd like to, you know, to talk to him about that.
So on CNN Sunday morning, Candy Crowley had me and Gary Bauer on, and the topic was going to be 20 minutes on religion and the election, and it got, you know how it does, it got shrunk to about 10, and she mostly
That's still pretty good for television, you know.
She mostly wanted to talk about Cain, so I had to pivot to all the other issues, but Cain was the thing. So Cain became the religious issue she wanted religious leaders to talk about. So in the middle of all the stuff with Cain going on in the last couple weeks, what would you ask him about his faith and all these stories and what that means? Is that important or not?
I would have, if I had been you and Gary Bauer, I would have felt very uncomfortable in that particular 10-minute segment, because I am, on the whole, I think that there is a weird and deep hypocrisy in the way sex is talked about in campaigns. And I think the Politico story was totally legitimate. As far as I can tell, they had you know, what they reported was true. These are legitimate questions to ask if indeed he harassed someone. And yet, knowing, you know, I've been around politics for a long time, and let us say that I know that sinfulness is not uncommon among public officials in this particular area. And it's always struck me as almost random as to who gets caught out and who doesn't. And I have really resisted writing about the Cain story, even though I have very strong feelings about, you know, sexual harassment, and I think there are things that are absolutely wrong to do, and so I think it's a legitimate story. You know, and that he should have answered questions about it earlier. He's finally going to do it tonight. I thought there was something very hypocritical about saying, well, no woman has come forward when they made an agreement not to talk about this in their settlement to get out from under all of this. So that's all true, and I could write all of that, but there is something about, you know, just a hypocrisy about sexuality in public life that that bothers me. So in this sphere, you know, what are you going to ask Cain? Do you believe in the adultery commandment? I mean, in other words, I'm not sure what you would particularly learn by probing religiously in this area. You know, and you know, we all know that. Well, never mind. I'll just stop there. So it's not. What I'd like to know more about. I'd like to explore what Cain has actually said in this area. It doesn't strike me that Cain has put faith at the center of his campaign.
That he's a lay minister and so on, yeah.
Yeah, but he hasn't really made it part of his campaign, and so I don't know. I mean, I would love to have an argument with him about how 999 fits with a sensible, Christian social approach, and I have different views than he has, and I'd love to have that argument. Yeah. But that's that's different from what is a legitimate question for a nonpartisan reporter to ask a candidate.
It wasn't covered, and neither Gary Barr and I wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, I can imagine.
As I could be accused of totally ignoring her question, my pivot was so fast to other things, To be bipartisan then, you mentioned, I remember, you were there for that speech that Obama gave, and you said afterwards it was the most important speech that a candidate had given since Kennedy's Houston speech on religion and politics. So that was, if you haven't read that carefully, you really should, for a lot of reasons. But then, what would you ask him about what that's meant then, since he gave that really powerful, thoughtful, historic speech, I think? What would you ask him? He's up there too now, to be bipartisan. What do you ask him about?
Oh, there are all kinds of questions I would like to ask him. I mean, I would love, because he's so candid about how he came to Jeremiah Wright's church. The problem is he doesn't want to say a word about Jeremiah Wright. I always wanted, I hope someday when he's out of politics, he has a sort of, offers an account of the importance of Wright to him as a human being. Because, I always thought there was something to the cheap psychoanalyzing that Wright was an important father figure to him, and that there were some reasons for that made sense to me. I did actually have a conversation with him during the Wright business, and it was very interesting because, a lot of people quoted Martin Luther King against Jeremiah Wright to condemn Wright. And there are a couple of things about this. One is, it's entirely true that a very significant chunk of King's preaching was about conversion of adversaries. And so there was a sort of different attitude toward white Americans reflected in, some of a good part of his preaching. But there was also an angry Dr. King. And there's a very good book on King called The Spirit of the Lord is Upon Me, and the subtitle is something like The Public Performances of Martin Luther King Jr., and it's by a guy called Jonathan Ryder, who's up at Columbia. And King spoke differently to different audiences. He didn't speak, his principles didn't change, but he had a different approach. And by 1968, he was very angry about the Vietnam War and a lot of other things. And I actually wrote a column quoting some angry King to say, wait a minute, there were problems with some of the stuff Jeremiah Wright said, but don't say that King was all harmony and Wright is something totally different. It's more complicated than that. And I'd started talking to Obama about this, and Obama immediately got to the interesting point. He said yes, and Jeremiah Wright didn't come to his ministry until the late 1970s, when whatever the timing was right. We've got that on, and I don't want to misquote him or misremember the history. But it was really in either the late King period or after, when there was a lot of anger in the black community in the post-civil rights period. And he says, so to understand Wright, Obama said, you have to understand that he came after that, and that's who he was. And then we went on from there. And he was, anyway, it was a lot of fun to talk to him about that. And he knows that David Brooks and I like Niebuhr, and so I've forgotten what he said, but he said that was very Niebuhrian, wasn't it? And he was kind of playing with me, but it was actually very Niebuhrian, the thing he said. But I'd like to know more about his conversion story, which, because he's been public about it, though I don't blame him for not wanting to talk about that more now. I'd love to know more about the importance of Jeremiah Wright's church. I'd like to know about the importance of the Catholic Church to Barack Obama, because his first salary was paid with money from the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. He worked for a Catholic church when he was doing that community organizing, and there was a whole theory that President Obama joined the Jeremiah Wright Church because a lot of African-American Protestant preachers thought maybe this guy is a Catholic agent. And I thought, poor Barack Obama, he has been thought of as a Muslim, as a Catholic agent, you know, as a non-believer, as, you know, all kinds of things. Secular Marxist, you know. So anyway, I'd love, so there was a lot of stuff. It would be, you know, fun, you know, and Jim and I, as you probably know, got to know him back when he was a state senator, so had some of these conversations with him at the time. But I'd just love to draw him out. And then I would ask him, why didn't you talk about this more in the second, you know, once you became president? And also, why did you choose not to go to church publicly as often as you might have before? I'd love to know those things. I'm not sure those are how much of those are legitimate campaign questions, but there are a whole ton of things I would like to ask him, which someday we might, you know.
On the King point, I'm not sure how many of you know that when King was killed in Memphis, the sermon he was going to preach that next Sunday was titled, remember Jeremiah right here, the title of King's sermon was, "America May Go to Hell." That was King's sermon the Sunday after he was killed. That was the title he was going to preach, which sounds a lot like the Jeremiah Wright stuff. And some think the reason that Obama hasn't chosen a church is because he's afraid of the sort of political, rhetorical preaching history of the preacher in the church that he might choose.
And I'm always reluctant on this because sometimes I think my analysis has nothing to do with faith and everything to do with politics on this question. But I thought that if he wanted to, he could choose a number of churches. He never had to join a church after this fiasco, and everyone would understand why he might stay away from joining a particular church. I think it would be intriguing. You know, I loved it, for example, when he went to a small, very poor church in Anacostia one Sunday. And, you know, there are a lot of interesting churches around D.C. that are actually part of different parts of Obama. So I think that would be intriguing. But, I mean, in some level, that's his business and not mine. But I view this as someone on the outside looking at him as a politician and a public figure and what messages he chooses to send.
It's interesting. They're Bachman and Perry are criticized by the left as talking about their calling, you know, that God's called them to run for office, and the left can't understand that. But as two people who talked to Obama, because we knew him from that history, you know, he talked to us about whether he should run for president. You know, that was a question he was trying to, so he talked to lots of people. But, you know, I was one
I don't think he actually ever asked, I'm not sure I ever had that conversation just to...
He called me one night, and we had a long conversation about this, and the issue of calling and vocation was a part of that conversation. Is this what he's called to? What does that mean?
See, I always like to think of distorted tabloid headlines that come out of people's words. So, evangelical preacher compares Perry to Obama. That's the distortion of what Jim just said.
Right. But seriously, how the question of calling
or Obama is like Perry, preacher says.
The calling and vocation is sort of a normal question for people of faith and people who aren't people. Vocation is a question for...
Right, well, you have a calling to be a doctor, which is not necessarily, or a nurse, or a teacher, which is not even necessarily religious. But that's right.
But some journalists say, oh, he thinks that God talks to him every morning about what he should do, and it's maybe that's not quite what he was saying. So we could talk about this all day long, and we often do. So let me just turn over to you. Questions for EJ?
Please.
Well, I guess it seems sort of...
My Chelsea friend has to ask a question. I want to put you on the spot.
I guess, so I want to get back to what you think are, what questions are legitimate, religious questions asked of a candidate. And it seems to be that, and this is also what, Professor, you touched on Sunday, that, you know, if it is a religious question that maybe indicates, you know, how their moral compass will help them govern, you know, if they believe in certain religious ideas and it will compel them to support foreign aid or something like that, That's certainly a legitimate question. What if it's a religious belief that they say will have zero impact on how they govern, but it's maybe something that reflects who they fundamentally are as a person? For example, what if they believe a candidate says, you know, gays should not be allowed to marry, but that it's a states' right issue and that should never be something that they touch as president? You know, this is certainly something important to a lot of people, but if it doesn't affect their governing, is that a question that should be discussed?
That's a really good question, and I concede. I think I would concede up front that the lines that I would like to draw can sometimes get blurry, but in this case, that candidate would be pressed for his or her views on gay marriage itself, which would be legitimate. I can't imagine either the left or the right letting them simply get off the hook with that. And so then once they're pressed on that, I think it's fair to ask, you know, to what extent does this arise from your religious convictions? Although I'm not sure that second question helps you that much, because it probably does in some way, for someone who is opposed to gay marriage, have something to do with their religious beliefs. I guess the question is, where does it help you fully understand them? Because what I worry about is, well, one of the things I worry about is, well, you can't have that public position because it comes out of your faith, and you're imposing your faith on us. Well, no. I think, for example, my views on poverty are decidedly affected by Catholic social thought. Now, I believe that in a pluralistic society, if I'm a candidate, I have an obligation to argue for the programs I would support on grounds that I can't just say, God says we should do this, therefore you should pass my Omnibus Poverty Act of 2013. I have to make a case for the provisions on grounds that everybody at this table could accept or reject that have nothing to do with my religious faith. And so, and so I worry that if all you're doing is asking, well, does that come out of your religious belief, then where does that lead you? Because in any event, that person has to make the case, I think, on grounds other than their their religious beliefs. But it may well come out of them. It's interesting because, and I want to move on so other people can get in, but it does, my story about the CNN thing, there are things you can learn about someone that are fascinating, about what makes them tick, that are of no that don't have a direct influence on how they would govern. And I suppose some of those things might come out in a sort of autobiographical treatments of the person, where when one is doing a profile of someone, you might ask all kinds of questions. When I did a long profile of Gary Hart when he ran for president, and I was utterly fascinated by the impact of the Nazarene Church on who he was, both what it taught him and what he reacted against. And I actually took a special trip down to a Nazarene college just to talk to this professor who had introduced him to Kierkegaard. That was back in the days when journalists could say, I want to go for one interview to this town in Oklahoma. I can't remember if it was Oklahoma or I can't remember where that Nazarene College was. And it was fascinating. And I did write some about that because I thought that was central to who he was, even though publicly he did not, it was central to his biography, even though it had no obvious impact on his public life. So I think there is, where my line gets difficult, I think, is on the question of biography.
You love this line by Adam just said he's Catholic and might run for office. So I love this line. I am committed to the separation of church and state. I couldn't care less if a candidate believed in a one-eyed, one-horn, flying purple people eater.
It's a song out of the 50s.
All I want to know
how did you know that one?
Is if that belief will influence their behavior once in office, which makes sense, but the lines do get blurry. The inappropriate question asked of Hillary about her marriage showed people what makes her tick, and as you say, who she was, and it was very appealing. in that context. So the lines aren't always clear. You want to speak to your purple people eater, religious?
I liked that song when I was a kid, by the way. The one-eyed, one-horned, pied purple people.
This is somewhat on a different note, but going back to the appropriate line of questioning, I look at the questions that Vice President Biden faced during his early campaign in 2008 and the questions that Senator Kerry faced in 2004. Is there an appropriate standard of questioning for Catholic Democrats in this day and age?
That's a question I'd love you to address to our bishops, actually. I think, I mean, I guess there is. I think it is because the Catholic Church has made abortion such a central part of its political teaching ministry, if you will, if I can call it that. I think Catholics will inevitably face this question. And I think it's a fair question to ask Catholic candidates. I personally think it's very dangerous what has happened in the church, and here I'm not speaking as a journalist, but as I mean, they all come together. But this is the Catholic me speaking here. You know, what troubles me is that if a Catholic candidate does not take the position that abortion should be illegal across the board, and this becomes a block for large sections of the church leadership, what they are in effect saying is no moderate or liberal Catholic can ever be elected to public office with their support. And I think that's a real problem. You know, and I do think there are prudential questions that are legitimate within the framework of a Catholic living in a pluralist democracy about, for me, especially in the first trimester, where what is the balance between defending the right to life versus the damage done to the law because of illegal abortions, that's Thomas Aquinas' point, and to potentially to women because of illegal abortions. And so I asked actually a bishop once the question, if you had, let's imagine two scenarios where you made abortion illegal and you discovered the actual number of abortions only dropped 25%, and that was partly countered by an increase in deaths among women who had illegal abortions. Then imagine that as a society we did everything we could to make welcome children into the world, to make poor women comfortable, that we would help them with their children. And I said the church can't endorse this, but what also if we had family planning that reduced unintended pregnancies, and we discovered that the actual number of abortions dropped 35%. Prudentially, which is the better choice if you're Catholic? I think that's a legitimate way for a Catholic to think, and yet in a campaign, you know, I think, you know, my position would probably destroy me from both ends, but you know, I think it's problematic for the church. But I think it's legitimate to ask because you're part of an institution that has made this a very important part of its public, you know, public position on public issues.
Right. Whenever Chelsea wants to speak, by the way, just
yes, we want. Yeah, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I just have a deep bias in favor of people from Massachusetts. Yeah.
This sort
and baseball teams and football teams and the like. Go ahead.
This sort of follows off of what Adam said, and I was wondering, this is sort of a two-part question. First, do you see any distinction between how a politician or elected official formulates policy based on how their faith informs their conscience versus how they might be imposing their, you know, religious traditions, ideals on the public? I guess my sort of thoughts on that is, do you see a difference between faith informing, for example, poverty policy or human rights policy compared to something like, you know, a candidate advocating, for example, I guess the personhood amendment is a good example of that's one definition that one faith tradition or many faith traditions might take on when life becomes life. And is that separate from, you know, a preferential option for the poor or something like that? And if so, you know, which one gets weight and how do you sort of sort that out?
It's a great question. I think there are two sides of it. The easy one I'll just can't resist dealing with, which is how does the position actually match with your tradition. I once debated Ralph Reed of the Christian Coalition back in the days when he was with the Christian Coalition, and I said at one point, I will always defend Ralph's right to base his, many of his political conclusions on his religious beliefs, because in some ways that's what I've done in my life, so I can obviously not attack him, although I would like him to explain to me where Jesus endorsed a cut in the capital gains tax, because I just cannot find that anywhere in my New Testament. But I think that the line you have to draw, and it's difficult, is you can reach whatever conclusion you want as a public figure on the basis of whatever reasoning process you choose, whether it's secular or religious. But you have to make the case for public action on grounds that are accessible to people who don't necessarily share your religious view. So there are secular arguments and practical arguments for poverty. Now, there are also values arguments for acting on poverty, and there the line gets thin. And for example, I do believe that many of the beliefs of secular people are actually influenced by religious traditions. I think a lot of people have views about poverty who are atheist or agnostic, whose views are nonetheless shaped by what Isaiah, Micah, Amos, or Jesus said. And it's the impact of the Jewish or Christian tradition on the larger culture that actually affects our views even when people are secular. So the line gets thin, but I think you have to make the public, it doesn't matter how you get to your conclusion, and some people will have, and I think for most of us, if we're honest, it's, if people are religious in some way or other, their views are usually a mixture of influences. I mean, I know not every single thing I believe is shaped by the fact that I'm Catholic. I've been influenced by other, Michael Walzer and Mike Sandel and a whole bunch of other people I can think of have influenced the way I think, whom I would argue in some ways are consistent with that tradition, but they're not that tradition. So I think the test is, can you make a case? The same can be done on abortion. There are, there are grounds. I mean, what's his name? He's a very conservative, brilliant Catholic. Well, it was Robbie George and Tollefson is the last name, but they wrote a book called Embryo, and they were trying very hard to make a pure secular case for when life begins. I'm not sure I fully agree with them, but I admire the effort they made, because it was a real effort on, to make the case to people who might not share the Catholic assumptions that got them there. So anyway, that's.
But then Doug Kamek, who was a Pepperdine Law School dean, I think, very Catholic, very pro-life, but he ended up supporting Obama because he thought Obama's policies to support low-income women, et cetera, unwanted pregnancy would reduce abortion more than the policies being fixed.
That's
by
that's where,
the Republican side.
that's that 35-25 example. Yeah. I think that's.
And as a pro-life guy, he said that this would help my cause more, but the bishops, of course, didn't take that view. Okay.
Over here?
Yes, Daniel.
So I think a lot of people have been surprised at how robust or maybe tough Obama's been on terrorism. So like upping drone strikes and even increasing the troops in Afghanistan. As someone who's known Obama for a while and has known sort of the way, I guess, he looks at faith, have you been surprised as well, or and what do you think of it? Yeah.
I think there is. I talked to somebody whom I've known for a long time who works in the administration, I want to say 6-8 months ago. It's in a column, so you can look up the exact quote, but it was basically he said people don't realize how cool and tough this guy is in meetings when thinking about this. And Obama never presented himself as a pacifist. He's not a pacifist. I think he operates like probably a lot of politicians do in a broad sense within a just war tradition. And if you talk, for example, to the CIA about the drone strikes, they argue that They are very careful about using them. They don't, they keep an eye on these houses, which they can actually do now with technology. If they see kids around, they're not going to bomb the house. Now, we can argue about that, and there is an argument about collateral damage, and collateral damage is part of the just war analysis. But I'm not actually that shocked, because I think there is this cool, even occasionally cold toughness that's in Obama. It doesn't show it all the time. And sometimes I'd actually like him to show it in other respects, but I think that's very much part of him. So I'm not shocked by this, actually. I don't know if Jim is, but I'm not.
Well, Rita's Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech was mostly why nonviolence won't work.
Yeah.
Which some of us didn't think he should have gotten it, didn't deserve it yet, and thought it was not a particularly helpful speech in that regard. But
see, I'm more Jim and I probably are separated a little bit. I'm probably a little more of a Niebuhrian realist, and Jim, I have deep admiration for pacifists, but I was drawn to pacifism in that. Well, I'll tell you a story. When I was registered for the draft, when I was 18 years old during the Vietnam years, I checked the little box that said I was a conscientious objector. And I spent a good month, 2 months writing, I've forgotten how much time I had, writing this pacifist statement as a Catholic. And I remember sitting down one day when I was done and reading it, and you know how a 18-year-old is, you look at it and you say, this is pretty good. And I said, there's only one problem, I don't believe this. And my doing the CO thing made me realize I believed in just war and I wasn't a pacifist. But I grappled with pacifist arguments because I admire their moral consistency, but I decided I wasn't one. But
yeah. Eric, you were next, I think.
I guess the comment earlier sort of reminded me of an anecdote from, I believe, your book, where Al Smith is asked about the papal encyclicals, and then he turns to his aide and says, "What the hell is a damn papal encyclical?" or something like that. Exactly and it kind of reminded me of that. But I, as someone who sort of grew up vaguely in the religious right, I wonder if you think that and based on what you said, do you think the media narrative to a certain extent is self-reinforcing? And that.
What do you mean by that? I think that's a brilliant observation. I want you to.
Or I mean, do you think that, on the one hand, more people in the religious right tend to think that they're kind of the only expression of religious thought in America, and then maybe that leads more people to it, and then maybe that leads to a more concrete media narrative, and if not, maybe. More broadly, just what you think can be done to broaden the conversation around the religious right and just the way that is expressed in the media.
No, that's a really good thought. It's a very tricky question because, a popular phrase among Christians in general, but I think Christian conservatives in particular, is the way. And I do believe that they believe with real sincerity and conviction that they have the way. And there's a clarity to that. There's a moral clarity which I sometimes admire because I probably don't have the same degree of moral clarity that they do on some of these questions. And so, and so I think that's part of how they legitimately look at the world. I think the difficulty is, how does that view translate into politics in a pluralistic democracy with the First Amendment? And that I think, and the Christian conservatives in America are not the only people who've had this problem over the centuries. That if you have a degree of moral certainty of this sort, then you believe that tolerating quite a few alternatives is really the equivalent of tolerating evil. And you're not supposed to tolerate evil. I would argue that the Christian tradition says a few good words about humility and the dangers of believing oneself as infallible, and the dangers of translating all commitments directly into state policy. In terms of the media, I just think that The media goes to where the action, in defense of the media goes to where the action is.
So start with, let's go Rob and Trent. And sequence.
So you've talked a lot about today what the approach of journalists should be when covering individual candidates and what they've talked about. I'd love just to hear more about stepping outside of that. I know, and you've talked a little bit about writing about religion qua religion with the Vatican and that sort of stuff. I'd also love to know what your thoughts are on how journalists should approach covering religion in, I guess, the general sort of broader social milieu, and like how religious voters, irrespective of particular candidates, are approaching issues, and just getting outside of reacting to individual candidate statements, writing about that.
Why do you both ask? That's a great question.
Okay, I was also wondering if you had any predictions on Republican strategy for the upcoming year to woo the religious right, if it's going to be something like wedge issues like we've frequently seen before, especially in light of the House reaffirming "In God We Trust" as our national motto, or are we going to see something different possibly this year?
Let me answer that one first. That one in some ways is easier than your question, but they're both good questions. I do think some of it is going to remain the same, as you alluded to, by the fact of what the Congress is doing. I think that Republicans realize that right-to-lifers are an important piece of their constituency. They're not the whole constituency, but they have been an important part of the Republican vote in some ways almost since Roe, but certainly since the 80s. And I think all the candidates are going to sort of act on that assumption. I mean, it's one of the reasons why Romney has switched his position on abortion from the time, he gave a very persuasive case in Massachusetts about how pro-choice he was. And so I think that will continue. I think what's striking is they have backed away from active use of the gay marriage issue. And I think in comparison to 2004, you're going to see a lot less of that. And I think that reflects some real change in public opinion, and a realization especially that among voters under 30, including quite a few evangelicals, that issue doesn't have the benefit for them that it may have had even 3 or 4 years ago. So I think it's going to be interesting to watch this difference between the two issues. I think that issue will be narrowcast to constituencies that resonate to it. But I think it'll be, my sense is if Mitt Romney is the nominee, he wants to run a campaign that is largely on economic issues and wants to run against Obama on the basis of, quotes, economic performance. And I think that he'll narrowcast some of these issues to constituencies. I think his difficulty is he may have to spend more time than you want to in a general election reassuring conservatives who don't think he's truly conservative. And I think that'll be tricky for him. That it doesn't mean he can't win the election. He certainly can, but I think that's his challenge. On your question about religion in the larger milieu, I mean, there are, I just would, part of me just would like more space accorded in newspapers and on the radio and television to debates among religious people, the way religious people live their lives, even the occasional piece on the good work they do. And I don't say that as special pleading, but I think there's a remarkable amount of good work that secular people who are deeply skeptical of religion would be amazed by. It's not just, they're not the only people who do it. There are a lot of secular people who do good work too, but some mix that gave you a fuller sense of what people in religious communities are and do, because they don't spend all their time talking to each other about abortion. Indeed, in the Catholic Church, most of the public energy of the Catholic Church, most of the actual energy of the Catholic Church is in Catholic charities and in the Campaign for Human Development and in Catholic Relief. I mean, it's an extraordinary panoply of activities that are not about abortion and gay marriage. And I just like to see coverage. And occasionally more coverage of how people make sense of God. My friend David Brooks likes to write occasionally about sort of the psychology and the human brain and God, and that's kind of fun. I'm glad he does that sort of thing. So, and then in the campaign, I just think stories that convey what people are thinking in an honest and sympathetic way can be helpful, including people you disagree with. I always tell younger journalists or students that your problem won't be that you don't present both sides of an issue. Your problem will be, how do you present the side of the issue that you don't agree with and probably thus don't understand? And I think one of the great challenges in journalism is to try to understand people who are different than you are and points of view that are very different from the ones you hold. And that's a real challenge. That's a challenge to every human being. But I think it's a particular challenge to journalists, and that we got to try really hard. Now, I write an opinionated column these days, so it's a different kind of work. But I still like to understand the people I'm disagreeing with and disagree with them on as honest a basis as I can. You know, and I'm not above using a rhetorical shot here or there, but I would actually like to understand what they're thinking, so I know what I'm kind of straight about what it is I'm disagreeing with. Anyway, that's a.
You know, to your point, it's even the narrowness, with great exceptions like EJ, but the narrowness is what the candidate thinks about religion or said, or what the religious issues are, meaning abortion, gay marriage. Even, they don't even really do well with how, in 2008, for example, the changing conversation among younger evangelical Catholic voters, the change in their notion of what the issues were, to include poverty, the environment, other things, directly led to changing voting patterns in key states like Indiana, North Carolina, Colorado, which was the margin of victory for Barack Obama. Now, that's a direct political story, and we had such a hard time getting people to even focus on voting patterns, changes in religious sensibilities in the electorate, and how that led to changing voting patterns, and how that had an impact on the election. Even that is harder. Like, they don't do the right kind of exit polling, you know, and so on. So I think that's a good point. Vale, you had your hand up. Is there anybody else who wants to?
Could I just?
Vale?
Could I say something quick to what Jim said? I agree with what he said, although certain states were so close that, you know, right-handed French Canadians could be attributed to, you know, in other words, there were a lot of groups that made a difference in
the right-handed
Indiana.
French Canadians were really a big factor.
Yeah, no, but not in Indiana. But you know what I mean. In other words, I've done the same. I say it with young people, because I think the under 30s were hugely important to that victory. They're both of what we said is true, but some of the states were really close, so everybody can claim an important part in President Obama's victory. Go ahead. Who was coming in? Vale.
Thanks so much for coming. I've really enjoyed the discussion on different religious traditions that we've had in this class, but as someone that doesn't identify with it, well, I attend a Unitarian Universalist church, which draws from a lot of different
Here in
traditions.
town?
Mm-hmm.
Which one?
All Souls.
Yeah.
Makes sense. And so I think, as someone that identifies as an agnostic, I really value that my church draws from a lot of different faith traditions to inform values. You know, for example, like I don't identify as Christian, but you know, I would defer to Jesus on matters related to social justice, since he knows what he's talking about. But I think that something that I struggle with is in the political sort of public sphere is that there's not a whole lot of willingness to people talk in terms of faith, but sort of what advice would you have for people that may not have a faith tradition to sort of build dialogue on these shared values and draw from a lot of faith traditions? Like how do you encourage that inner dialogue, whether it's interfaith or with people that don't have faith? I think that's something that's not often talked about, as people that don't have faith.
I want to go to the other person who's going to come in. I'm so glad you asked that question, because when I finished the other one, there was something I wanted to say on that very point, and so I'm grateful. Was there somebody else coming in? One of let's put this way. One of my favorite responses I ever got from a reader was to a column that ran under the headline, which I got and acknowledged, from Leon Wieseltier, and the headline was "God Bless Atheists." And one of the, well, Leon Wieseltier of the New Republic had written a wonderful piece arguing, among other things, that atheists actually took the matter of belief more seriously than a lot of tepid or halfway believers, because they thought about the question very seriously, and that if believers could not find it in themselves to give effective responses intellectually to an atheist argument, they ought to go back to the drawing boards. They have the problem. And in recent years, I've gone through phases in this in the course of my life, partly in response to what I saw going on out there, and that for a very long time, my sort of bias, personal bias, if you will, was one of telling liberals not to look down their noses at religious believers. And again, not all liberals did this. It's not a sweeping assertion, but I ran into it. And you hear it when somebody who is liberal talks about Jesus land or flyover country, which really bugs me. Because if you look at American liberalism owes a lot to populism. It owes a lot to the middle of the country. It owes a lot to the states in that famous cartoon that were attributed to Jesus land because they voted for Bush. And so I reacted against that. In recent years, I have gotten somewhat worried about how non-believers are treated in the public square, especially at a moment when their numbers, because of your generation, actually seem to be growing. And I have never believed back, I think, even from the time I was a kid, that religious belief, a faith in God, was essential to being a good moral and social person. And I think sometimes there is that assumption in some of our public discussion, and I think that's wrong. That's why I hate Jesus wars at Christmas time. Not only because of the kind of potential for anti-Semitism there, but also what it says about people who may not believe in Jesus as Savior, or who may revere him in the way you do, but do not see him as God. And so I do believe that is also part of our public conversation. The one thing I would say is I think over the course of American history, Unitarian Universalists have punched way above their weight in terms of numbers in the public conversation. Now, some of that's a New England bias. That's where it came out of New England, and so Unitarians loom larger where I came from than they do in all other parts of the country. But I think the depth of their social commitment has meant that they have had particularly large influence. We even have one Unitarian president, William Howard Taft. And there was a little bit of controversy about having a Unitarian president at the time. But there was something I wanted to close with, and I should have written it down. I had no, but you know what? See, normally what you do is you keep talking until that that thought.
Do you wait for someone to interrupt you with a temporary thought to stall for a
yeah,
second?
please.
Okay, so it is, I mean, it's an important issue that the most unpopular electoral group in the country today is atheists, right? You guys may know this, but I mean,
more so actually
more
than
so
Muslims.
than Muslims, that's essentially an informal religious test for office. It's not saying it has to be a particular religion, but it does have to be a religious tradition, and a wide majority of Americans say this. And I do think that that's something that as generational change comes in the next 20 or 30 years and we become more secularized a bit, although we're not going to go to the way of Europe, we're going to have to grapple with politically. Because what do? We've got there are some openly atheistic congressmen, I believe, at this point in time. I think they're all men,
One
too.
or two.
Yeah. But, they're from Oregon, so they sort of get off the hook.
Which is like France.
And thank Dave, this is one of the reasons I love David, is it came to me what I wanted to close with. Yeah, but you were talking about they came from France or Oregon. I'll close with two things. A French pollster and I were talking about the whole issue of numbers you get on how much people attend religious services, and we both agreed, and I believe I am quoting him here, that the Americans overstate how often they go to church and synagogue because they feel guilty when they don't go. And the French understate how often they go to church and synagogue because they feel guilty when they do. The other thing I wanted to say was the response I got to the God Bless Atheists column, where I got an email the next day from somebody, a woman, I forgot where she was from, but she said, "Dear Mr. Dionne, I am an atheist, comma, but if I may say so, comma, God bless you." And I thought it was, I suppose that is the spirit of pluralism that I would like to see us engage in the country. But I do think that that woman, if I may say so, was a godly atheist. So thank you very, very much.
That seminar that you talked about, Bob Putnam's seminar where we met Obama, he has a book on Amazing Grace, which is a big book, but one worth reading in light of all of this. And he makes the point, the largest number, or the growth number now is what he calls the nuns, you know, the none of the above. At Sojourners, we'd like to be popular with both kinds of nuns, the ones that used to wear habits and the none of the aboves. But I think that kind of pluralism, at the rally on Sunday, most people there, I think, for the pipeline, would probably call themselves more secular. And they asked me to dress like a religious leader, so I wore my robe, my big black church robe. Boy, did I feel like I stood out like a sore thumb in Lafayette Park. But, you know,
I like thinking of you as a Benedictine, you know.
There's this moment when you're speaking to a group of secular people who are more secular, who are agnostic or suspicious, or probably could tell you a lot of stories about how they feel hurt or rejected by the church, and you're a religious person. And then you say something that is different than what they've expected. It's almost like a healing moment sometimes when people afterwards come talk. This woman said, it's like your comment there, she said, older white woman, she said, you know, you make me almost want to be a Christian. You know, not quite, but almost. So let's thank you, Jay, again, and appreciate the time.